It makes sense that people are curious about Stoicism again. It's one of the few tools that admits life is crap sometimes. So compared to Western spiritualism, it feels like a more sober, more realistic way to come to terms with that fact. The problem is, like any codified coping strategy, it ends up feeding the very system you think it's helping you endure. And it certainly doesn't ease loneliness. Let's talk about why. Picture this. It's 9 AM and you just got into the office. You're reading that dreaded email no one wants to receive from their boss. I've scheduled a pay review meeting with you for 9:15. The speech goes like this. Look, times are tough. I know you are due for a raise, but we all have to make sacrifices this year. It's not personal. You have kids, or maybe a dog with health issues, and you're barely scraping by as it is, and inflation is at 12%. Said boss sees your dis-ease and adds, I know you can handle this, and you'll accept this with dignity. You feel a burning shame, knowing he's seen the Marcus Aurelius book on your desk, sitting right next to your copy of Zen and the Art of Not Murdering Your Colleagues. And even though this is the third time you've been denied a raise, you go home, deciding to put into practice what you have read, to feel noble for taking it on the chin. After all, this is life. This is fate. You will endure. Here's the thing though. The people the boss goes skiing with, you find out they all got raises. So now you're trying to do the whole being noble thing while they sip their cognac and laugh about how loyal you are and grin widely at how easy it is to manage employees like yourself. Not to mention how great the word restructuring is when you need an excuse to axe everyone over 50. You're 49. So, given how many of you are being duped for someone else's gain, this noble acceptance thing is proving somewhat tricky. Especially when your partner, who can only work part-time because of the kids, yells, Aurelius, my ass, even if I can get more hours, which I probably can't, how do we get Maya to karate? You start to wonder, is not rocking the boat the best reaction? If you spoke up, and others spoke up, maybe things would change. Maybe injustice wouldn't feel so immovable. If this is your first time here, I'm Jordan Rain, a philosophy graduate with a severe allergy to self-help gurus, and this is The Loneliness Industry, a philosophy podcast where we look at the real reasons behind our disconnection. Here, we don't shift blame onto you for your loneliness, because loneliness isn't a personal failing, it's structural, it's built into the system we live in. In this episode, we're looking at Stoicism, and why we might consider it the less glittery, more rational-seeming sibling of Western spiritualism. Like spiritualism, it's a system of borrowed ideas that, whilst professing to help you cope with the horror of modern life, still quietly ensure that Western values keep reproducing themselves. Today, we're going beyond the fact that Stoicism doesn't just make you feel foolish for rocking the boat and asking for change, it seeps into our closest relationships too, making us look uninterested, avoidant, and ultimately more alone. And yes, today's episode was meant to be about something else, but I got a little sidetracked after the episode on Western spiritualism. I had several emails from people who wanted to discuss how Stoicism might help us cope better with the horrors of the world. Now, I get a lot of emails, and it does break my heart that there aren't enough hours in the day to engage with everyone personally. Though if you're a patron or supporter, I certainly will. In any case, I thought I would do an episode on this. Stoicism is interesting in that it offers us a far less narcissistic set of practices than Western spiritualism, and doesn't gloss over the fact that life is often shit. However, there are ways in which it seriously perpetuates both the values of Western capitalism and, more specifically, the power structures that maintain it, all while offering us the label of noble for enabling that. Yes, this is another positively packaged school of thought with a dark side, another coping mechanism whose values are disguised repeats of the usual Western stuff. So today, we examine Stoicism not just as some noble ancient philosophy, but what has unwittingly become another of capitalism's Trojan horses. A tool for disconnection and apathy. And I know a lot of you love Stoicism, and I get it, because what it professes to offer sounds a lot more realistic, and yes, not as delusional as stuff like Western spiritualism. Stoicism actually acknowledges the fact that existence is not a Sartrean smorgasbord where we can pick and choose the life we want. It is a way more down-to-earth, no crystals and orifices required way to manage our misery, our powerlessness, and the inherent unfairness of life. And I commend anyone who's even looking for a way to cope with misery that doesn't involve the solipsistic egotism or magical thinking of Western spiritualism. But as usual, we need to look below the surface, beyond even the system of belief itself, to how it is used, how it plays out in the system we're all part of, and the values it sets up, how it ends up essentially saying, why fight injustice when you can brand apathy as depth? Or, why stop being emotionally constipated when we can paint ourselves as intellectual and above such dumb desires as connection? So, what to expect today? Apart from me not trying to drop the F-bomb too early and invoking algorithmic wrath, today we're going to look at the basic tenets of Stoicism and how they profess to assist in coping with the misery of life. So, a bit of Aurelius, Zeno, and Epictetus for you. We'll then move on to how that philosophy plays out when it's transplanted from its origin soil into the Frankensteinian corpse that is modern Western culture. Ahmed and Nietzsche will all come in there and show us how acceptance and resilience play right into the hands of Western capitalism. Ainsworth, Bowlby, and Carl Gustav Jung help us understand how indifference and non-attachment feed right into our disconnection and potentially function to promote, or just mask, avoidant attachment. And finally, we will look at what to do instead of grasping for belief systems that can't help but be warped by the existing capitalist values that we laid out in the first 6 episodes. In short, we'll look at how not to let Stoicism reinforce your loneliness, even for those of you holding on to Stoicism for dear life. Under Stoicism, life is not that dear, and you can only hold on to it with dear indifference, so this should prove interesting. By the end, you'll see that while Stoicism isn't as clearly linked to narcissism as its golden child sibling Western spiritualism, it can still be quite a self-centered, self-defeating solution to those seeking intimacy, belonging, or change. And I take it, dear listener, that if you are listening to this at all, you are seeking at least one out of intimacy, belonging, or change, if not 2 or more. And for that, you have my respect already, because it is a search for which bravery is required, and for which sometimes the hunt for helpful tools just goes on and on and on. Let's start with the usual, defining our terms. So, Stoicism in a nutshell. You'll notice as I go that several of Western capitalism's values will pop up. Not the only surprise in this episode, especially if you thought that the ancient Greeks are about as divorced from Western capitalism as it gets. I'll be highlighting some of the issues as we go, so that when we get to Ahmed and Nietzsche, it makes more sense. So, tenet 1. Control is king, in certain circumstances. Central to the idea of Stoicism is control. Yep, that capitalist value we discussed in episode 3. However, for the Stoics, this is not control over everything. These guys did know that the world around us won't bend to fit our thoughts just because we mantraed and visualized hard enough. They were realists about limits, and for them, what we can control versus what we cannot gets sorted into 2 piles. Now it started with Zeno of Citium, who learned firsthand that you really can't control everything when he lost his entire fortune and livelihood in a shipwreck. Feeling powerless in the face of fate, he decided that he could at least control his attitude towards what had happened. And after reading about Socrates, he basically spent his days chasing down Socrates' philosophical descendants to push his way into their circles, not in a way that screams indifference either, more in the manner of like, teach me how to be chill right now, or I'll follow you around Athens like a stalker. Epictetus then did us a favour of putting things into gobsmackingly common sense terms. He said this: some things are up to us, and some are not. Think how different things would have been if philosophers had maintained that level of simplicity. In any case, shipwrecks, as an example, and according to Epictetus, are not up to us. Being enslaved and half crippled by a master, as Epictetus was, also fell into the not up to us pile. Responding to the situation by writing philosophical treatises, however, definitely earns him the award for best ever response to a shitty situation. Marcus Aurelius made the filing system of what is up to us and what is not lots clearer. Our judgments, impulses, desires and aversions were sorted into the pile of what we can control. Pretty much everything else went into the pile of stuff we have no say in. Our bodies, our bosses, our neighbours, the environment, weather, the people that insist they're Joan of Arc in a previous life. It all became a sort of internal versus external split, where everything outside of me is outside of my control, and everything within me is within it. So, okay, in principle, it wasn't meant to be a perfect binary like that. In practice, though, it ends up being just that confined. The locus of control is not just in the individual, it can only act on the individual as well. And you can see the first few potential match values for capitalism creeping in here. The focus on the individual and the reification of control. So more on these soon. In any case, this is what produces Stoicism's simple ethic. If it's in you, you can and should master it. If it's not, accept it. And this is why the Stoic wise person is a character who endures pain, accepts fate, and stays calm no matter what. Do note, however, that Marcus Aurelius himself didn't really manage that. His meditations read less like a serene wisdom book and more like a kind of mantra outpouring of like, don't freak out, Marcus, don't freak out, Marcus. If you lose it, we're fucked. Don't freak out. And you guys know my opinion of CBT. And you can actually think of this as kind of like CBT for ancient Greek dudes. You know the whole change your thought processes because it's them that's the problem thing? Stuck in a master-slave arrangement, i.e. a soul-destroying job, stuck in a loveless marriage, sucks, done it. We don't need to look at changing it, but here are some ways to change your reaction to it. The problem for Stoicism and CBT becomes apparent here. If your context is problematic, it counts as, an outside thing, so let's not alter it. And whilst there is some truth to the fact that you can't control a violent spouse or control a boss or a bullying colleague, we could still exert some level of control by leaving these contexts or smearing dog shit on their cars. For the Stoics, though, just like modern CBT, wisdom means focusing on the first box, our reactions. Now, the next key idea in Stoicism is that reason trumps emotion. Emotions, for the Stoics, are inferior because they are reactions to external things, meaning things outside your control. They call the passions, apathy, disturbances. And crucially, they thought these disturbances resulted from false judgments. And let's hone in there. An event occurs, and the Stoics suggest that we consider that event first, before doing anything else. And if we somehow fail at judging that event correctly, emotions will follow of the kind that will disturb us and cause suffering. But if we consider the event and come to the correct judgment, then the emotions that follow won't disturb us. Sound like a Greek and bearded version of Joe Dispenza? Yeah, because both still maintain an idea referred to as cognitive primacy, the belief that thoughts come first and your emotions follow. Now, in episode 4, we talked directly about how this was undermined way back in the 1980s by Zion's research. Following that, neuroscientists and psychologists showed that basic emotions come first, and in many cases, because our lives depended on that. Now, complex emotions, they prove to be concurrent with thinking about them. So no, thoughts and judgments, they just don't come first. And neuroscientists like Ekman, DeLue, and Barrett have demonstrated this, so see episode 4 for the detail and full citations on that. The issue is capitalism. People selling faux physics, new age crossover books and CBT all rely on us thinking that our thoughts come first and that we can control them to avoid the wrong emotions. There is money in that, and also a way to blame the individual for their own unhappiness in a shitty system. It just isn't an idea based on fact. But back to the Stoics specifically, who did at least have an excuse for not having read 21st century scientific papers. For the Stoics, anger, grief, desire, and all of these were considered irrational because they came from attaching value to things beyond your control. Now, to be fair, the Stoics did distinguish between bad passions and good feelings. They even had a word for it, which I will mispronounce, eupatheia. I mean, we do too, right? anger is bad, happiness is good in our culture. But they did it a little bit differently. For them, the good feelings were feelings that were considered rational. Literally, rational joy, rational hope, and rational caution. And I'd like you to hold that thought, okay? So rational emotions, rational joy particularly. Because quite aside from what Ahmed and Nietzsche will be saying soon, which is that emotions act as our compass, fear indicating danger, sorrow indicating how much we valued something, anger indicating unjust treatment and so on, this reminds me of something you might find interesting or funny or just horribly tragic. In Germany, the chocolate brand Rittersport cornered the market with a particularly famous slogan, quadratisch, praktisch, gut. This literally means square, practical, good. This was the advertising slogan for chocolate. And trust me, this is related because we're speaking of people who seem to have eliminated feeling and who also attempt to behave like rational androids. And this is chocolate, okay? I mean, what do you associate with chocolate in your country? Look at adverts in the Anglosphere, for example. Chocolate is all about sensuality, indulgence, and luxury. It is something experiential and enjoyable. But for those who value rationality so far above all else, as German culture does, chocolate must first be practical. And this really is like a modern example of rational joy. The purchase and consumption of chocolate is being made on a rational basis here. This chocolate is practical. Other brands are sensual, erotic, stirs up feelings. Passion, bad, go away. Here's the clincher though. I would argue that this kind of rational joy isn't joy at all. I would suggest instead that it is like entering numbers in a spreadsheet and behaving based on what that spits out. It is practical, check. I am hungry, check. I shall eat the chocolate. And the point is, once joy has to pass a logic test, it's no longer joy as we actually understand it, which really does leave us with just bland as kind of allowable feelings under Stoicism. Now, Stoicism, despite these faux caveats about certain emotions being acceptable, actually privileges reason, control, and detachment while treating our emotional life with deep suspicion. And this is something to consider when your kid has to quit karate because you didn't counter your boss's unfair treatment. Look, honey, don't be irrational. Your karate lessons don't pass the logic test of can we drive you there anymore. You know how it goes. If it isn't practical, it can't bring you the right kind of joy. So don't get upset. Don't get upset. Emotions are inferior. You don't want to be inferior, do you? It's just karate. Remember what Uncle Aurelius said? Life is horrible. So trust me, this won't be the worst thing you experience. Yeah, not the best idea of child rearing. Interruption. You probably expect these by now, right? I need to announce a few things, okay? So one is please sign up to the mailing list at thelonelinessindustry.net because I can't keep up with social media anymore. I hate social media. I'm an introvert and it's just too hard for me. I'm juggling work, full-time study and a podcast and serious health issues. So it's not a spam thing, so don't worry about that. I just use the mailing list to let you know when new episodes come out or if they're delayed, and it's way more reliable than YouTube recommendations. And if you would like the podcast to keep going, there is a way to support it that I always forget to mention. I released 12 albums. I was a musician for a long time. So if you go to Bandcamp, so bandcamp.jordanrain, or just go to jordanrain.com, then you'll find the music. There's 12 albums. It's hard to sift through them all. So just opt for Bardo. That's my personal favourite. It doesn't matter whether you support through the usual ways or through that. It all goes towards the podcast. Now, given that my music isn't for everyone, it's dark avant-garde or bloodthirsty Celtic rock, someone called it. I don't know if that's true. You can still use the usual ways, the donate button on the lonelinessindustry.net website, or you can go to Patreon, or you can use the join button here on YouTube, and there will be videos coming up that are available just for patrons and people on the YouTube community. Thank you so much to all of you who are already contributing. It is people like your good selves that make this continue. Thank you. On with the podcast. Lastly, when it comes to the privileging of rationality over emotions, We should remember there actually are some beneficiaries to this. And this is what Ahmed's going to point out soon. Remembering that the Stoic ideal is to live guided by reason, not by anger or grief or desire or even joy, calm detachment is what equates to strength. Now, without allowing yourself anger or panic that you can't feed your family, your boss will be stoked that you are unmoved by their crapness, that you don't have the slightest inclination to stick up for yourself or your colleagues who've been sacked for being 50. Your boss might not frame it as strength. More likely they'll use the words pushover, sucker, or who the fuck would get married to that. And we will talk more soon about how detaching from our emotions enables structural violence to continue. We'll talk about how Stoicism mimics the avoidant attachment style, read god-awful partner with no ability to connect, after that. But before we do, we need to look at the third tenet of Stoicism, the moral element. This is all about virtue as the only good. For the Stoics, the only thing that truly matters is living a virtuous life. And this is usually defined as embodying courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. What about health, compassion, and relationships, though? Those things are things that one should be kind of indifferent to. For the Stoics, they literally don't matter in themselves. They only matter in terms of how you use them, as in how you use them to develop virtue, in terms of the courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom part. So yes, relationships have instrumental value, but that's really it. They are tools to be used for other ends. And this is where the cracks start to show in terms of loneliness and disconnection. Your Stoic partner, if they're doing Stoicism properly, shouldn't see you as valuable for being who you are. More as a brilliant prop for stuff like practicing temperance. And your kids, their developing character and the deepening bond with them is not intrinsically worth anything. It becomes worthwhile when it contributes to your justice reps and definitely temperance again, when they vomit all over your vinyl collection and prevent you from getting any sleep for 6 years. The idea of virtue as the only good renders people in your life more like gym equipment for your moral workout. It centres, yet again, on your journey, your path towards coming virtuous. That will ring familiar to any of you who've listened to the episode on individualism and the hero narrative, or even the one on Western spiritualism. When we start treating people like tools for our own virtue, it isn't just morally questionable in itself. We also kill real intimacy and connection. In other words, this Stoic virtue mission is individualism and its hero narrative in action. Which brings us to the ideal Stoic. To summarise the three tenets, okay, we have already 1, control over the self. 2, rationality being the ideal and emotion being deeply sus. And 3, virtue as the only good. Now, the first 2 show how Stoicism fits with capitalist values directly, and the third fits in with the hero narrative and how we instrumentalise others. We now have a fairly good picture of the Stoic hero, if you will, and she is kind of non-present. She is serene, unshaken, untouched by the messiness of human feeling. She doesn't cry when her child dies horribly. She doesn't rage when she gets paid less due to her gender, age, or skin colour. She accepts that whatever happens is according to nature and considers herself dignified in her endurance. For the Stoic, inner calm is everything. Partner, kids, they're part of the outer world, and we can't control the outer world, so trying is kind of dumb. Just accept it. And, I know you may still be thinking that all this is appealing if you're thinking of yourself in isolation. If you frame life as just you, tightening your belt, stiff upper lip, soldiering through the war, but unless you really have been successfully atomized, life is never just you. You've got friends, siblings, kids, partners, friends, a dog, a cat, the store clerk that you always say hi to, all of whom are affected when you decide to turn injustice into some noble test of your personal character. Stoicism keeps the focus on individual endurance, and just like when capitalism does the same, it blinds us to solidarity. In short, it perpetuates several of capitalism's core beliefs, but can do us the favour of hiding our moral laziness behind the glaze of moral superiority. What Stoicism really offers becomes this. Why risk rebellion when you can just stay at home and look profound for doing nothing? Why work on genuine intimacy when we can glorify detachment and disappointment? Now we're going to delve deeper into each of these offerings in turn, beginning with Ahmed and the quashing of rebellion. Now this section is called How Stoicism Encourages Moral Lassitude in Wasted Lives. As usual, the fact that Stoicism has its issues is not just some random assertion that I pulled out of the void. There are well-known philosophers whose theories either speak up against it directly or that help frame how Stoicism comes to undermine change, community, and even the possibility of living a rich and fulfilling life. Sara Ahmed, for example. Now, Ahmed reminds us that emotions are political and politicised. Anger and pain, for example, in our culture are seen as negative and something to be eradicated. However, for Ahmed, anger and pain are not personal glitches. They're signals that point to where justice is failing, or even where power imbalances exist. In The Promise of Happiness, she shows how Western culture divides feelings into positive and negative. Ahmed highlights how certain emotions are cast as negative, like anger, unhappiness, and refusal, not simply because they're uncomfortable, rather because they threaten the social order that benefits from you not having them. Let's illustrate this. Back to the office, where your boss has said, "I know you'll accept this with dignity." Here's the translation. Please metabolize this injustice internally so the machine can keep humming. Under Stoicism, doing so is made to seem virtuous. Regulate the self, keep calm, endure. Ideal for your boss. For Ahmed, this kind of thing is always what power asks for. The kind of emotional austerity that preserves the status quo. Stoicism says, don't complain, accept fate. But Ahmed points out, sometimes being the one who complains is the ethical thing to do. Think about it. If your kids get cheated, if your partner gets disrespected, if your colleague is treated unfairly, what's more ethical? Smiling and swallowing it, or refusing to smooth it over? And Ahmed highlights that the person who speaks up is often branded as sort of killjoy, the one who ruins the mood by pointing out what's wrong, or who ruins the racist joke by refusing to laugh, or who makes the family look bad by pointing out that Auntie Carolyn isn't just the one leaving cat shit on your windscreen, she's also the one stealing Grandma's pension money. Ahmed reminds us that speaking up against unfairness is integrity. It is refusing to let comfort or harmony come at the cost of justice. Now, Ahmed takes issue with these so-called positive emotions too. For example, happiness. She makes the point that in the same way so-called negative emotions are used to regulate society, happiness is also used as a disciplinary tool. The reification of happiness becomes a demand to be agreeable, upbeat, resilient. And if you don't quash your annoyance and appear jovial in the midst of exploitation, you're framed as being difficult. Now, Stoicism might require a less ludicrously inane response, because, faking indifference when someone demotes us to toilet cleaning duties is arguably kind of less nuts looking than smiling like a game show host. However, it still works as a way to draft us into that same role. The key point that Ahmed raises is this. Your anger at the unfairness of not getting a raise was never a deficit. It was a coordinate. It told you where to push, who to gather, who to name. Quelling that anger? Another example of how capitalism and the systems it co-opts, like Stoicism, train us to detach from our inner compass. And this is the take-home from Ahmed. Dignity without dissent is just complicity. Inertia in the face of injustice is laziness. And if she has a message for us, it's really this. Be the killjoy. Don't buy into the script that calls your refusal irrational, because in a world that profits from your silence, speaking up is care. And disruption, That's solidarity. Now, Ahmed helps us see how Stoicism sidelines anger, grief, and complaint as irrational, which conveniently makes injustice harder to confront. And somehow you have still managed to hold on to the idea that Stoicism is fine, so long as there are no freedoms, communities, rights, or individuals you actually give a shit about. Brace yourself. Up until now, it kind of looks like Stoicism was a term paper that's been given a C-. This next guy gives Stoicism 200 years in a barracks latrine for daring to exist at all. We now turn to Friedrich Nietzsche, patron saint of maximising the number of drinking hours in relation to time spent doing one's tax return. Nietzsche thought Stoicism was essentially the philosophical version of putting a straitjacket on your instincts. Even his arguments against Stoicism embodied its antithesis. He had zero patience for performative reasonableness and refused to dress up his dislike for Stoicism in the calm detachment that both Stoicism itself and academia demanded. For Nietzsche, reason wasn't some higher, purer faculty. It was just another instinct, and often a weaker one. To privilege reason over passion is to deny half of what makes us human. And this is all linked to his idea about balancing the Apollonian and Dionysian forces. The Apollonian forces, it's like order, clarity, restraint. Apollo's neat geometry. And the Dionysian is like revelry, ecstasy, chaos, like Dionysus drunk and dancing. Now, essentially, for Nietzsche, you need as much Dionysian energy as you can handle, but the Apollonian has to be sort of at sufficient levels so that the Dionysian stuff doesn't destroy you. So it's this balancing act. This means that Nietzsche wasn't saying that reason has no place, but he saw reason as the one with instrumental value. It had value only in so much as it served life rather than smothering it. The real weight, the real worth was in the Dionysian though, the overflowing ecstatic life force that Stoicism tried to strangle. It's kind of like this. Imagine you just went shopping and bought a stack of wine and chocolate and super like life-nourishing food. Avocados can be Dionysian. In order to carry the stuff home, you need a bag. If you don't have a bag, everything will fall out of your arms and roll away and or break. Reason is that bag. It's just the container. What is in that bag, that container, is what really has value. The container itself, only valuable because it enables the elements to be held. So when Stoicism says reason above passion, that's like saying the bag is more valuable than all that nourishing, amazing stuff in it. Calm detachment instead of joy, rage, or grief. Well, Nietzsche openly and directly labelled this sickness. He was pretty direct. He called Stoicism a disease of reason that tries to choke out life's instinct. Yeah, you so don't need a doctorate-length analysis when it comes to what Nietzsche thought of Stoicism, but here's a quote anyway. Stoicism is self-tyranny, the violence of reason against nature. Now, this quote from Twilight of the Idols also references the Stoics' claim that they want to live according to nature. Now, in Nietzsche's opinion, the Stoics had a similar take on nature as maybe people today who've spent their entire life living in gated communities and would probably die within 5 seconds if they ever managed to find actual wilderness. Because what is nature really? It's not calm and detached. I mean, unless you're thinking of Central Park as nature, or one of those German forests where they've literally killed all the wolves and planted the trees in rows according to species. Yes, they do that here. This is not made up. Nietzsche points out that nature is raw, cruel, brutal, painful, and also overflowing, ecstatic, chaotic. The Stoics did not live like that. They didn't embrace that kind of nature. Instead, they cut the definition of nature until it fit their grid. And you'll know this trick from previous episodes. It's called rewriting the narrative. The Stoics rewrote the narrative to paint nature as rational, orderly, indifferent, and serene. Less like honouring nature, and more like using it as a cheap shot to prop up their argument. Which, it has to be said, was the done thing at the time. Right? This was an epoch where, as nature intended, could still pass as a justification. rather than being recognised as the knuckle-dragging chant of today's intellectually underpowered conservative contingent. Back in the time of the Stoics, people hadn't yet realised how tautological and logically flawed that argument was. Cheers to human Moore for sorting that out later. Shame the modern dating advice sphere and said conservative contingent still haven't learned to fucking read. I digress. This is where Nietzsche's hammer really hits. He sees Stoicism's obsession with calm endurance as life-denying. Anger, grief, even desire, these are not irrational disturbances. They are life speaking through us. They are our vitality, our compass. To amputate them in the name of virtue is for Nietzsche cowardice. He would say, if you swallow every insult from your boss and call that noble, you're not wise, you're just sick with resignation. And then there's Stoic virtue. Nietzsche saw virtue as a word that was very often used as code for obedience. Whose virtue? He asked. Who benefits when calm acceptance is called strength and resistance is called weakness? Right, the people already in power. Across the centuries, Ahmed and Nietzsche agree on this, and it's worth highlighting that life-denying aspect too, because those in power, such as bosses, they often do a great line in denying you a life, so any behaviours that you might adopt yourself that enables them to do that, awesome for them. Nietzsche did not see greatness when Aurelius praised endurance and obedience to fate. He saw herd morality in disguise. He saw virtue as a trick, a way of turning your chains into a performance of superiority. So, of all the ways to unmask Stoicism, Nietzsche's is likely the most outspoken. Where Stoicism says, rise above, Nietzsche says, stop the foe's superiority, get back down in the dirt and wrestle. Feel your rage, feel your joy, and for God's sake, don't mistake resignation for dignity. Because once you're too virtuous to resist, you've already handed victory to the system. I want to turn more directly to loneliness now. Now, I know a lot of us actually are too tired to fight and might actually be thinking, fuck it, now I just feel doubly bad because I should fight, but I'm too tired and too time poor, and at least I could have felt a bit more okay about myself with Stoicism. And you're not wrong. I mean, being time poor and exhausted is the crucible for all this. And our systems make sure that we're all permanently time poor and that we feel crap about ourselves. As usual, my real concern here is connection. And whilst protecting those you care about, or our rights, or the rights of others, is part of connection too, I would like to get to the grassroots of it here, to why Stoicism and the behaviours its values demand will essentially ensure and or perpetuate your loneliness. First, imagine this. You're on a date with someone you actually really like, and you want to show that you're calm and grounded and disciplined, not needy or desperate or excitable. You've read your Stoic blogs, and maybe even the daily Stoic audiobook. It's so you don't let yourself light up or look too keen. Instead, you sit there composed, detached, and dignified, nodding politely as they speak, not asking too many questions, and when they're curious about you and lean in to ask you questions. You play it cool, a few words, and nothing that might betray your inner world or private thoughts. And when your food arrives, you eat in relative silence. And you might even interpret this as calm and going well, like your own relaxed vibe has emanated outwards, like you've pulled off mysterious and wise, and that Aurelius would have been proud. Here's the thing. When you're on the receiving end of that, and I have been many, many times, it reads as disinterest, under many lenses too. It is not pleasant for either party, because for the poor Stoic person, they're wondering why others just give up on them after one or two dates, while those others that are doing the giving up are thinking, ouch, that person was totally bored by me, or maybe they're emotionally unavailable. And if they have any self-respect at all, they'll be forced to conclude that seeing someone who has no curiosity in them makes no sense. But is it really disinterest? Because, if someone is not interested in you, just leave, right? The problem is, with Stoicism here in the mix, disinterest isn't always just disinterest. The Stoic just ensures it looks that way, if the Stoic manages to go on any dates at all. Sometimes it really is just because someone thought Stoic composure was all admirable and stuff. And sometimes it's avoidant attachment dressed up as Stoic composure, because that's easier than dealing with attachment issues or even knowing that you have attachment issues. And of course, sometimes this disinterest is a tactic, like for dickwads who read books like The Game and don't realise that anyone who knows what negging is can usually see through their crap immediately. Fucktards who read The Game aside, I want to speak to those of you who do see other human beings as other human beings. To those of us who don't treat connection like a chess game and are doing their best to connect. Which means, back to our Stoic friend and their dating life, it makes sense that from the inside, with Stoic, behaving with detachment and calm can feel like strength and self-control, like doing something right for once. The problem is, from the outside, like I said, it lands as indifference. It looks like all of the things that a healthy human being would walk away from. Because anyone who has read anything on psychology and dating, or even just basic human behaviour, knows when someone doesn't ask you questions, it means they're not interested in you. If they do want to connect on any level other than the physical, they'll share some personal information. That's brief enough on its own, but you can do it in a sentence. Disinterest looks like lack of curiosity and closedness. Two things. Check, check, goodbye, if that's what's going on. The problem is, with Stoicism in the mix, that's not always what is going on. And this signal mismatch means that two people who might actually have gotten on well enough if they'd just been open with each other turn away. The one who insists on the Stoicism mask will repeat the same ritual with someone else and wonder why they just can't meet anybody, because unbeknownst to them, they look unavailable, uninterested, and essentially like the prime archetype of no thanks. Needless to say, this is great for Western capitalism because lonely, disconnected people don't rebel either. Instead, they buy things like more books, coaching and dating courses that, should they ever manage to ditch Stoicism or Stoics, they will learn entirely new and different ways of not being themselves. I don't want to digress. What I want to do instead is to get to those who somehow, despite all this, manage to pair off. Because the sad thing is, this isn't even limited to those who are single. Sadly, if you're in a relationship and adopt Stoicism as a stance, it is still guaranteed to deliver, as in perpetuate your loneliness. Enter an acquaintance of mine. Now, he's kind of starting to question Stoicism by now, but he did adore it for several years, and whilst deep in its throes, he explained it to me like this. Now, I don't have permission to use this, but he's technically still a Stoic, so he won't give a shit. Kidding, I did ask. He said this once in an email, and I'm sharing it because I think it's well written and that maybe some of you will relate. Stoicism helps me invoke a sort of numbness. I can detach from everything when that happens. That feeling is how I know I'm doing the right thing. It helps me do my duty. It helps me just get on and do what is expected of me. No one badgers me as long as I do what's expected of me. Now, I don't know about you, I can feel the resignation in that. And it's worth adding that this person is on several medications for depression. He and his partner don't really communicate, and both of them often speak of loneliness. And he found Stoicism, and it helped him disconnect, but not repair. And it's helped him neither leave nor communicate, just to accept that things will be awful. And I can say all that because the sad fact is, none of that info makes it possible to identify him. So there are so many people out there in his or her situation. And for those of you who are brought up with Christianity, you might recognise this as a dressed-up Christian suffering ethic. And others of you might recognise the communication breakdown or the crippling fear of conflict. Now, Stoicism aids and abets these things. It also provides a virtuous-looking excuse for fear of conflict and failures to communicate. Importantly, these things are also typical of what I want to talk about now, avoidant attachment. Now, avoidant attachment 101. There are 4 attachment styles, right? One of them is healthy, it's called secure attachment. Then there's the anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and a mix of anxious and avoidant. I'm not going to go into all of the other ones. Avoidant attachment is basically a strategy for surviving closeness by shutting it down. Now, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth were the first to show how avoidant attachment is learned in childhood as a survival strategy. Hazan Shaver later demonstrated that it doesn't just vanish when we grow up. It comes with us into dating, marriage, and other forms of intimacy, even friendship. Ending up avoidantly attached happens like this. You grow up in an environment where reaching out for comfort gets you punished, shamed, or ignored, and you learn fast that showing need is dangerous. Maybe your parents told you to stop crying, or don't be dramatic, or God, you're oversensitive, or go to your room until you can be calm. Because the lessons are sometimes subtle, sometimes not, but the message is the same. Emotions are bad, and if you want to stay safe, you'd better shut them down. In other words, rational, calm behaviour, please. Emotions are something to be ashamed of. Now, as a child, your nervous system adapts. That's the survival part. It learns, don't need, don't ask, don't show. Vulnerability becomes a liability. So as an adult, when intimacy stirs up feelings, your body goes straight back into its childhood rulebook. So wall it off, cut it out, shut it down. The thing is, a lot of people are avoidantly attached. This is not some rare edge, have to have spent your childhood locked in a cellar in Belgium thing. It's a widespread way of coping. And I would argue that some cultures actively encourage it. Take Germany, for example, where openly talking about your inner world is so derided, dismissed, and labelled as weakness. When your feelings are treated as embarrassing or inappropriate, not just at home, but across your whole society, it produces generations of avoidant attachers. And Stoicism offers a great way of making this look virtuous, of pretending that it's not problematic. And it's no surprise to me when the people I date here in Germany mention Stoicism, which they do with monotonous regularity. When a culture or individual is already trained in emotional austerity and in never admitting that anything is wrong, they need to validate how they are or even make it look morally superior, because that's a whole lot easier than really self-reflecting. And by the way, reflecting on the self is not a favourite pastime of anyone who has learned that the inner world is something to be ashamed or scared of. And Stoicism makes the strategy of cutting off one's emotions and desires look noble and even healthy, because cutting off desire, we can call it tolerance and never mention our fear of rejection. Refusing to share one's inner world of feelings, we can label that dignity instead of admitting our fear of opening up and our fear of vulnerability. And avoiding curiosity about others, self-control, not rigidity or self-focus. Put it all together, and what is really just flavours of fear and shame gets repackaged as admirable. And whilst that might seem like a convenient way for avoidants to never face themselves with honesty, it is sometimes just stumbled upon by them and feels like a fit. Because let's face it, not everyone even knows about attachment styles, and when they do, they may not see themselves in it. And they certainly don't want to rock up to a date and say, "Hi, I'm Hans and I'm avoidant." But now we get to the much deeper tragedy. The avoidant actually longs for connection. That is the paradox at the centre of this attachment style. They long for connection and they fear it at the same time. And the longing, it does drive them to try, but the fear takes over at some point. And this is a fear of the demands that attachment might place on them. They fear loss or rejection or engulfment, all the horrible things that happen in their childhood. The avoidant longs for connection, yet their strategies for dealing with all their fear around it ensure it can never come about. You hold back to feel safe, and the other person reads it as rejection and backs off. And then you conclude, see, intimacy never works, thus reinforcing all your childhood programming. And that is the sometimes crossover between Stoicism and avoidant attachment. It's how both become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The very thing meant to protect you from rejection guarantees you'll be rejected. And calling these tactics stoic doesn't make them into wisdom. It makes some plain old loneliness that hopes to look less tragic. And for those inside relationships where connection has died or never really existed, Stoicism keeps you doing what is expected of you, as my friend said, but by society, by the roles you bear, by your fear of rocking the boat. What it doesn't do is help you undertake the things that might make it better, like actually communicating your needs or leaving when there really is something wrong. In these situations, Stoicism doesn't build strength. It encourages repression. And remember that sentence my acquaintance said? Knowing you're doing the right thing when you cut off your needs, go numb and do your duty. That is repression in action. And this deserves a closer look as well, this repression of what we desire. Carl Gustav Jung argued that what we repress doesn't disappear. It goes into the shadow. And the shadow isn't just some spooky metaphor either. It's the psychological basement where all your unwanted, embarrassing or dangerous parts get shoved. Those rejected desires don't sit there quietly. Jung looked at how they sneak back out in more twisted forms. The classic example, the Catholic Church. Repression of sexual desire. Just look at what kind of twisted sexual acts resulted from that, and who had to bear the brunt of a priest's great facade of chastity. And whilst it won't always be that twisted, it still erupts at some point, through sarcasm or passive aggression or sudden eruptions of rage or flings with their yoga teacher or self-destructive bouts of spending, drinking, eating, or just that sense of numbness that slides into depression. So when Stoicism tells us to cut off desire, or when avoidance tells us to numb our feelings, what we're really doing is feeding the shadow. We're setting ourselves up for exactly what Jung warned about, the return of the repressed. And you can call it composure if you want to paint this as Stoicism, but your psyche calls it unfinished business, and it will come back, usually in ways that don't look noble at all. And this is the really bitter irony. Emotional austerity doesn't just keep us from rebelling against the system. It means we end up rebelling, somehow and in twisted, unpredictable ways, against ourselves. We swallow the anger, the longing, the grief, and they don't dissolve, they ferment. Their new and twisted forms could go off like a bomb of self-destruction at any point, or seep like poison into our relationships, our work, and our bodies. And instead of intimacy, what we end up with is distance. Instead of dignity, we end up with resignation. And instead of strength, we have a brittle mask that cracks the moment life pushes too hard. So, what to do instead? I mean, have you found yourself in any of this? Have you found yourself drawn to someone only to shut it down because it was too scary? Did you ever choose a sensible person instead, where you would not be overwhelmed by your feelings? I feel for you if you have. And it's how avoidant attachment makes us behave. When we dress it up as Stoicism, though, it doesn't serve us well. So if not Stoicism, then what? What school of thought should we follow instead? Here's the issue. Any pre-organised belief system is going to carry the same risks. Why? Because they get repackaged to serve power and the system in one way or another. All of them eventually become a script, a mask, a manner of shutting down feelings and rebellion. So my answer would never be, find a new school of thought. With any pre-written idea, we must make sure to ask what values are embedded in it. Question what is being asked of you. If it's just compliance and adherence to the values that already do us ill, do what Ahmed says, rebel. Be the killjoy. What does rebellion even look like? Well, in the case of a culture that asks you to be rational and tells you that only some feelings are acceptable, feel. In a culture that sells you the lone wolf ideal and atomization, connect. Instead of hiding behind some philosophy tombstone, take the risk of being alive. Tell someone you're curious about them and then actually ask them questions. Speak the pain that isn't being heard. Demand better for yourself and others. That's not a school of thought, right? That is just what it means to be human and to care. Conclusion. Let's be fair first, because Stoicism does have its appeal. Unlike Western spiritualism, it doesn't gaslight you with talk of lessons or blessing in disguise when life is shit. It doesn't deny that awful, unjust, grinding crap happens. It says plainly, life is painful, unfair, often brutal, and there's no magic escape hatch. That realism can feel grounding when everything else is just shouting positivity mantras at you. But here's the catch. Realism alone doesn't equal connection. What Stoicism offers in honesty, it steals back in austerity. Yes, it admits the world is cruel, but then it trains you to endure it in silence, and it replaces grief with resignation, anger with acceptance, and desire with numbness. And what that creates isn't strength, it's loneliness. We began with that accept this with dignity pay review speech. Stoicism as emotional austerity your boss can bank on. Ahmed showed how that austerity polices feelings so that the machine keeps turning. Nietzsche ripped the mask off. Call numbness virtue, and all you have is a muted life. And in the most intimate rooms, on dates, at dinner and bed, avoidant attachment turns the same script inwards. Stay cool, say little, need nothing. Jung finished the picture. Whatever you cut off doesn't die. It comes back as distance, depression, or destruction. And here's the headline. Emotional austerity manufactures loneliness. Out there, it stops solidarity. In here, it starves intimacy. Your anger, which could have mapped you to allies, gets domesticated. Your curiosity, which could have built a bridge, gets rebranded as weakness. The result isn't wisdom, it's isolation, with excellent posture. And no, Stoicism isn't the nobler upgrade to Western spiritualism. They're twins in different outfits. Where spiritualism sells faux enlightenment, like you can manifest your way out of grief, Stoicism sells faux cool. You can reason your way out of need. Both relocate problems inside you. Both reward compliance, both avoid empathy, and both end at the same destination, loneliness. One tells you to raise your vibration, and the other tells you to quell your passions. Either way, you learn to stop asking for help and stop offering it. Perfect for capitalism, disastrous for connection. So what do we do instead? Not a new school, a new stance. At work, refuse dignity as silence, name the harm, gather the people, make the demand. In love, choose curiosity over cool, ask the follow-up, offer one honest sentence about what you felt. In community, mutual aid over resilience. Resilience without each other is just austerity with PR behind it. With yourself, notice when I'm being stoic really means I'm afraid to need. Then choose need instead, with boundaries, not walls. If Stoicism trained you to accept domination, let rebellion retrain you to connect, because life is often miserable and loneliness makes it lethal. We don't survive by looking profound, we survive by showing up for each other. And to sign off, I would like to say, keep the tombstones. I'll take the messy dinner, the awkward questions, and the friend who's a little bit erratic. Now, until next time, the usual stuff, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next episode in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for listening. Bye.